Hi, everyone. Welcome back. Hope you've all suitably caffeinated. We're going to move on now to our second panel, which is on reconstructing networks. So moving from thinking about correspondence and social networks to thinking about networks that are maybe a little less visible or can be reconstructed from ephemera. And to lead us in this discussion is Maeve Kane. Maeve is an assistant professor of early American history at the University of Albany. She has published articles on archaeology in the journal Ethnohistory and Indigenous Networks in the Journal of Early American History. She is currently revising a manuscript titled Shirts Powdered Red, Haudenosaunee Women and the Politics of Atlantic Consumer Civility from 1600 to 1860, as well as an article-length network analysis of an 18th century mixed-race Anglican church. So Maeve will introduce each of the speakers, who will then speak as we did with the first session.
Thank you. I'm very pleased to introduce our three panelists, Cameron Blevins, Justin Gage, and Adam Aronson. Cameron Blevins is an assistant professor of history at Northeastern University and a core faculty member of the new lab for text, maps, and networks, where he studies digital humanities, spatial history, and the 19th century U.S. Cameron's work has appeared in the Journal of American History, Modern American History, and Digital Humanities Quarterly. His current project, Gossamer Network, is under contract with Oxford University Press and uses spatial analysis to reinterpret the 19th century American state. Some of his broader interests include geography, gender history, and information visualization. Justin Gage is an instructor at the University of Arkansas and next year will be a postdoc at the University of Helsinki. His research focuses on Native American networks of communication in the early reservation era and the ideas spread through them. His forthcoming book, We Do Not Want to Gate Close Between Us, Intertribal Communication in the Colonized American West, 1870 to 1895, from the University of Oklahoma Press, examines the creation of these networks despite the restrictions of the U.S. government's reservation system. This year, he will work to incorporate his research into a digital project that analyzes intertribal networks funded in part by a Cone Foundation grant. He will also continue work on a second book project tentatively titled Writing to Resist, Literacy and Native American Activism from 1870 to 1900, which examines how Western natives use literacy for social activism to preserve their cultural identity and to reestablish a sense of sovereignty. And finally, Adam Aronson is an associate professor of history and the director of urban studies at Manhattan College. His expertise is 19th century North America, especially the cultural and political history of slavery, the Civil War, Reconstruction, and emancipation. He is the author of two award-winning books, The Great Heart of the Republic, St. Louis and the Cultural Civil War from Harvard University Press, and Banking on Beauty, Millard Sheets and Mid-Century Commercial Architecture in California from University of Texas Press, as well as co-editor of The West in the Civil War, Testing the Limits of the United States, and co-editor of Frontier Cities, Encounters at the Crossroads of Empire. His current research after the Underground Railroad is a political, economic, and family history of the collective experience of African North Americans crossing the U.S.-Canada border, mostly moving south during and after the Civil War. He has presented related research in the Journal of American Ethnic History, at the Library of Congress, the Buxton Homecoming Genealogical Conference, the Tubman Center, and in a forthcoming essay in Unsettling the Great White North, African-Canadian History. More about his research can be found at adamaronson.com. And I think we'll go in the order on the
All right, thank you. Can everyone hear all right? Good? All right, I just want to start by thanking Adriana and the rest of the conference organizers, and especially Maeve Kane for commenting on our papers here. And I'm going to be talking a lot, actually not that much, 10 minutes specifically, today about territory and space, and in particular the relationship between territory, space, and state power. And given that topic, I think it's especially important to begin by acknowledging the territory and space that we are occupying right now. This conference is taking place on land that was seized from the Lenni Lenape by British colonists in the 18th century. This is one episode in a much longer and larger process of settler colonial occupation that I think really defines American territory both throughout history and today. And today I want to talk about how that kind of process happened on a larger scale and in the context of the Western United States. This transformation of space, people, and land, often referred to as Western expansion, that kind of crystallized during the second half of the 1800s. So the basic outline of the story is probably pretty familiar, right? So by 1848, the United States territorial claims extended from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. But the West itself remained firmly under the control of native peoples. It was not actually part of the United States in any practical sense. By that point, it had taken around 250 years for Anglo-Americans to occupy the eastern half of the United States, and it would take a single generation for them to effectively conquer and then occupy the western half. This process was, from start to finish, made possible by the American state, by the federal government. This is all well established amongst historians, but what I want to talk about today is a question I think really doesn't get treated with that much specificity. This kind of basic question of where was the state? Where was the American state? And I don't think we've grappled with the kind of implications of this state-backed project of dispossession and then occupation. When you stop to ask this seemingly basic question, it opens up a whole series of new interpretations about the nature of 19th century governance and state power. This is drawing from my larger book, Gossamer Network, that looks at the 19th century's largest federal institution, the U.S. Post. And in particular, this project uses a data set of information of more than 100,000 post offices that were collected by the philatelist Richard Hellbach. And I'm happy to talk more about this kind of process by which transform this data into these maps. But you can actually map out the spread of this network. And I'm going to show you a series of these maps using Hellbach's data set along with data from a project from the University of Georgia that maps out native land holdings and when they were officially kind of ceded and seized by the United States government. So this is what the West looked like in 1847, right? In green is native land, and you can see that this was, again, native land. This was not at all controlled by the United States, even in the following year when it claimed territory. And I'm going to show you a quick animation of what then happened over the next 40 years. Again, the span of a single generation. You can map out the spread on a year-by-year basis of the postal system in the West. What you're seeing is that this is not taking place in this kind of uniform wave moving westward. It's taking place in fits and starts. So you can see the particular geography of settler occupation, native dispossession and settler occupation across the western United States. And I think a lot of times we treat this as a monolith, as a general kind of idea of Western expansion, and what I'm hoping this project does is give spatial specificity to where and how that process unfolded in particular contexts. All right, but by mapping this, I think it also prompted me to ask, again, kind of basic questions. How did this happen? Right? How did this happen across such a large scale and in such a short period of time? All of these thousands of different places. How did this network even work? How did it operate? Because the more you look at the U.S. postal system during the 19th century, the less familiar it can start to appear. It was the largest postal system in the world by far. This is a scatter plot comparing national postal systems. You've got length of mail routes on the bottom x-axis and the number of post offices on the y-axis, and the U.S. is all the way up in the right-hand corner. This is a global outlier in many ways, but it begs the question, again, how did this massive institution actually operate? And a second thing that I started to realize was that this is not a kind of network I was expecting, a stable government network. Instead, if you actually map out not only where post offices were established, but also where they were discontinued. What you see on the right is a map of post offices that were either discontinued or changed names or locations at some point during these 45 years. And what you're seeing is this almost ghostly map of locations. This is a landscape of discontinued post offices, a much less stable network than one that I kind of got used to thinking about when I think about government institutions. And in trying to answer and kind of figure out how this network spread and operated, I ended up kind of arriving at an understanding of this network that challenged some of these basic assumptions we have about 19th century government and the nature of the American state. And in particular, it can be summarized in 3 words, I think. One is bureaucracy, these kind of hierarchical government institutions. Second one is coercion, right? The use of force or monopoly on the use of violence, to use Max Weber's famous formulation. And the third one is centralization, the idea that government decisions and policies kind of originate from the center and then spread outwards across the periphery. And instead, that's not what the U.S. Post actually did in the countryside. The urban postal system was quite different, but in the rural United States, where the vast majority of post offices were located, it operated according to what I'm calling an agency model. This was a system that was highly decentralized, very little administrative oversight. It was operated by private actors and semi-privatized actors, temporary part-time positions, and then finally non-salaried positions. This is not a bureaucracy. And so in the context of the postal system, what you'd have were government contracts to carry the mail on private stagecoaches. These were temporary, short-term contracts. And then post offices themselves don't look anything like we associate them today. They're not freestanding government public buildings. These are private businesses or residences in which the postmaster was paid a very small commission to distribute letters from that private space. And about 95% of American post offices looked more like this, rather than these big kind of federal buildings we associate today. And I actually started thinking about this as an algorithm a while ago, but I was glad to hear last night thinking about algorithms. Algorithms are just kind of a recipe or a solution to some kind of problem, right? In this case, I think the agency model is a spatial algorithm in the sense that it is a way of solving the problem of how do you operate, function, or provide services across a large geographical area. In the 19th century, this was a major problem for all sorts of organizations. And it's not just the U.S. Post that operated according to this model. To set up kind of some of the 2 next papers that we have, right, the U.S. Pension Bureau operated this way. So to evaluate whether or not people deserved pensions oftentimes required an in-person medical exam of a veteran. That was done by local private physicians who were paid a small commission by the federal government. Same with the U.S. Census, right? Collecting information about millions of households scattered across a huge area were done by part-time enumerators, again, paid a small fee to operate within a specific territory. And then finally, to set up Justin's paper a little bit, there's a temptation to see this kind of spread of a network and think that it is, in fact, universal. And if anything, what I've realized is that it's not, right? And you can see this kind of hole that looks like it's been cut out of the center of the network. That lines up with Indian territory. So this kind of expansive coverage or government institution and service was not, in fact, universal. It was highly shaped by questions of race, by questions of citizenship, during the 19th century. And I'd like to think more as Justin gives his paper about how Native people were actually using this model despite this lack of coverage. So I want to end by kind of returning to these 3 features of the state, right? The U.S. Post represents a different form of government. It's one that was not bureaucratic, one that did not operate according to coercive power, and was highly decentralized. But just because it did not share those kind of traditional features of state power does not mean that it wasn't significant. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you for having me. It's really an honor to be here. It's really bizarre thinking that I'm at the APS and such a storied institution. I also want to thank the APS for the Phillips Fund. If you're not aware of the Phillips Fund, I am a former recipient. This work was funded in part by this incredible grant. It's really hard for Native historians to find money to fund Native American research, and this is one of the few that we can point at and say each year they give out several fellowships. So thank you, APS, for that. This is a project that has come together as a book. It was my dissertation. I've made the unwise decision today to try to summarize that, at least the first half of it, in 10 minutes. So I'll begin. Native Americans, they maintained a life of mobility in the late 19th century, despite colonial control and confinement. It's a tenacious mobility, and I define it not only as the freedom of geographic movement, but also the ability to express their ideas widely. And this allowed Western Native Americans to create these vast networks of communication that transverse the boundaries of reservations created by the U.S. government. So these intertribal networks, they were threaded together by intertribal visiting and letter writing, and this fostered a growing sense of community amongst tribes. Now, even though most Native Americans lived west of the Mississippi River, they were on these 100-plus reservations managed by the Indian Affairs. They still were able to exchange ideas, communicate over these really long distances. Now, these reservations, of course, were experiments in acculturation. They're designed to contain natives, keep them away from each other and from all the settlers coursing across the plains. But as remote as they seemed to white Americans, they were not disconnected from the outside world. So if you take a closer look at the records of Indian agencies, if you look at the letters written by Native Americans themselves, you see this dynamic world where intercultural communication among Native Americans was ongoing, and where Native Americans controlled their own sources of news and information. Oh yeah, this is not a touchscreen, unlike the other one. So the U.S. government, they try to suppress this intertribal communication because of the anti-colonial notions that were being spread among Native Americans. Officials were afraid of the impact of this information on their efforts of assimilation. For the government, the solution to the so-called Indian problem was to isolate, depending on geographic isolation, keeping Native Americans in a space where they could be controlled, set distant, and as the Secretary of the Interior put it in 1865, Indians had to give up their wandering life, remain within imposed boundaries. And so as part of the effort to suppress Native identities and to make their identities more American, they needed to keep them in a place. But of course, they did not allow themselves to be kept prisoners on reservations. They thought that they would have the freedom of movement. They expected it to be given to them. When that freedom was threatened, they fought to keep it. In 1888, we have Little Wound on the left, Red Cloud, and Young Man Afraid of His Horses, all Oglala Lakota leaders. They sent a letter to President Grover Cleveland that complained about geographic restrictions. They said we should be permitted to make friendly visits among each other as white people do. They argued, of course, after all, the president himself said that he wanted us to be friendly with each other. We do not want the gate closed between us. Now, while these folks undoubtedly had limitations on their movement, on their communication, they were not allowed to pick up and leave. That was breaking the rules. But they found ways to interact with those outside of reservations. They constantly submitted requests to visit foreign tribes, people living on other reservations. More than 80 Western Indian groups, and probably many more, were given passes to visit distant agencies between 1888 and 1890 alone, varying from parties of one to parties of hundreds. And at least 60 different groups traveled off reservation to visit in those same years without permission. They did it anyway, defying the wishes of their agents. So scholars have painted this picture of an animated Western world before and after Europeans arrived, before the reservation years. This animated world doesn't disappear once tribes are forced onto these reservations. So during the last quarter of the 19th century, natives throughout the West, particularly those living great distance apart, they were visiting each other more than perhaps ever before. These visits were made for social, economic, political, religious reasons. Natives from different backgrounds, they shared knowledge and they related each other's experiences. Of course, railroads made these trips from the Dakotas to Idaho or Utah or Nevada, across the Rockies into the Great Basin. The railroads made it more practical. So they used this modern means of transportation to move around this continent, increasingly bound together by rails. As soon as railroads were laid near reservations, visiting became easier, perhaps more frequent. All of these Western lines carried Native men, women, and children to visits, even to dances. Now, even with accessible transportation, visiting persisted only because natives demanded it. They tried to limit contact from the very beginning between tribes, but it was very difficult for them to control the movement of thousands of individuals. And so reservation boundaries were permeable. At the ground level, agents, they had to contend with the resolve of the people. In order to maintain stability on the reservations, they had to oblige those who expressed their dissatisfaction with the restraints on visiting. Moreover, many chose to just travel without permission. Despite the threats of punishment, they would leave anyway. Also, we have the written language passed along by the U.S. Postal Service in many cases. It bridged the gaps among reservations, allowing men and women to communicate efficiently across the vast distances. They used the government's culturally repressive education for their own purposes, especially in an effort to direct their own lives, expand their culture. And so distant acquaintances, friends, family, they could share news, express their thoughts and belief, and this accelerated this development of this larger intertribal community. Now, of course, to acquire the skills of reading and writing in English or their own native languages, many Western natives sent their children to schools in the 1870s, 1880s, and literacy course did not make these children less Indian. They used the Americanized education instilled at these schools as an anti-colonial tool. Natives wrote to ask for more schools and more teachers because they thought it could be an advantage. But of course, government agents, they also manipulated and coerced parents and children to attend these schools. It's important to understand that many educators use physical or mental abuse to eradicate Native ways of life in their students. But despite the undeniably negative aspects of these educational policies, the number of Indians who went to school rose throughout the 1880s. By 1889, nearly 11,000 Lakotas, Santees, Yanktons, Mandans, Grovants, Utes, Paiutes, Shoshones, Bannocks, Repos, Cheyennes, Kiowas, Comanches, Apaches, Wichitas, Poncas, Pawnees, Blackfeet, Crows, Omahas, Winnebagos, and many others. Nearly 11,000 of them could read in English or their native language. Only 9 years earlier, less than 3,000 could read. Only 4% of the members of those tribes could read in 1880, but by 1889, the number reached 17%. So natives used new sources of knowledge, now open to them in the ways they chose. There were newspaper printed in native languages as early as 1871. Natives were also devoted readers of white magazines and newspapers, and they used those to inform themselves. So Native Americans could pluck information from the national web of communication. Literate Indians, what they would write to officials to complain, to make known their opposition to rules and regulations. They wrote to defend their land rights, to protect their cultural norms like dancing. They saw that mail offered practical benefits, and Cameron, we didn't plan this, but this is a trader store at Pine Ridge Reservation. This is the post office near Wounded Knee Creek. The man there is not he's an agent of the Postal Service. So each agency had at least one post office. Some had multiple, and they become these hubs of communication for the tribes. Letters written by Native men, women, and children, they passed through the borders, and they were sent to other reservations, bridging reservations largely outside of the control of colonialism. They built these inter-Indian networks through correspondence. So families were tied to families, tribes to other tribes. Those separated by the consequences of colonialism or by geography, they could be in touch. They used the English language as a common language. Tribes without a previous relationship, they could forge new bonds. Tribes that were once enemies could make peace. Leaders used this correspondence to sway minds, to hash out disagreements, to inform others about the dirty dealings of the United States government. And these letters spread warning of disease, plans of improvement, eyes of change, and they exchanged cultural ideas, especially religious ones. All right, I'm out of time. Thank you very much.
Okay, great, thank you, everyone. It's great to be here and to hear the ways these papers are really coming together. The last two papers really describe projects that are at the end. Though I've been at it for a few years, this is really the beginning of this project. It's a third book project, and for better or worse, one of the things I'm finding is I wandered into this through my research in St. Louis, and I started to identify these networks of African North Americans who were moving mostly south back across the border after the Underground Railroad. And though there are homecomings and sort of ongoing parts of this community, they often think of themselves as very focused on the story of going to Canada, that the Underground Railroad story, the fugitive slave story, story that is celebrated here in Philadelphia and celebrated in Canada. What happens after that? The fact that people continue living beyond 1860 or 1865 has very much been less focused on. And so that's one of the challenges, is to figure out how to tell a story about people who don't tend to tell the story about themselves. So, some of the African North American border crossers are very famous people. Some of those you see here: Marianne Shedd Carey, Martin Delaney. You may or may not know some of these other people, but Mifflin Gibbs, for example, writes the only extensive memoir of someone who had gone. He actually had been in San Francisco, and then he goes to British Columbia, and then he comes back and takes a judgeship in Arkansas, and he actually has an ambassadorship later on, and he talks about going to the White House and meeting with Teddy Roosevelt during the period where he's an ambassador. He has, in this book of about 500 pages, he has about a paragraph and a half about coming back and saying, like, well, I left a country that had slavery, and our status, even in California, was threatened by the Dred Scott decision. I'm coming back to a country that's embracing Reconstruction and the promise of equal rights. In general, though, this goes almost unremarked. And one of the questions I had is, do people think of their time in Canada as being a refugee, being in exile, waiting to come back to the United States and embrace the United States as a place that would be a place for equal rights? Or do they generally think of their movement in economic terms or family terms? And you'll see I'm going to give you a little bit of all of that today, and the paper talks about some of that too. I'm building out of tiny little pieces of data, right? So this is an example, right? That these are lawyers in the South that are being listed. John Worley's and William Smallwood from Canada, A.W. Shadd from either Northern Ohio or Canada, right? They can't even make a decision about where he is. These are being listed in the Deep South, and yet they sort of they're paying some attention to it, but this is all the mention that it gets. Similarly, if you go to the Ford Museum, you'll hear about William Perry, who becomes the first African-American to be employed by Ford Motor, opening up what we think of as the Great Migration and the huge numbers of African Americans that eventually will work for Ford and other companies in Detroit in the automotive industry. You don't hear about the fact that William Perry is from Amherstburg, Ontario, right? That he's from one of these families that had spent time in Canada. It's not relevant to their story, and so they don't include it. Yet another example. So Jesse Binga runs the largest bank in Chicago in the Black community before the Great Depression. He is born in Detroit to a family who his parents had been born in Canada, their parents had been born into slavery in the United States. So I'm finding all of these moments, another one for now. Marianne Shedd Carey, as you may know, goes to Howard Law School. She lives right near Howard in Washington, D.C., and she allows her home to be a place where these African Canadians, if they want to get an education in Howard, they often stay with her. So an extended network of first cousins, but then really kind of anyone who has the right name comes to her. She's advocating for DC statehood, for women to have the right to vote, starting in the 1870s. So she's very politically active, but she's also helping train a whole generation of these individuals. As I mentioned, there is a version of this that continues. There are binational homecomings, one in Buxton, which is in southwestern Ontario, one in the Buffalo-Niagara area. There are others sort of along the border in these places where families from both sides of the border still come back together a century later to reinvigorate these ties, often over Labor Day or sometimes Memorial Day. But when I talk to people about these connections, they generally think of it as trying to honor their ancestors that had gone and escaped into freedom in Canada, rather than thinking about the return migration. You know, oh, well, I went to Detroit, but it was just for a job. Right? Like, yeah, our family moved to Ypsilanti, but, you know, that's just where they could go to educate, you know, have a job or get a better education. They don't think of the movement south in the same terms, though there is a group at the beginning during Reconstruction that do think about their political movements as very explicitly trying to regain this sense of equal rights. So those are the kinds of networks and questions I'm after, and as I said, there's a tiny handful of those at the top that are easy to track, but I want to kind of make a wider story best I can of everyone else. So where do I find those networks? So there are examples of chain migration. I mentioned those going to Marianne Shedd Carey's house, but in the records of the United Way, that's what you're looking at on the right, the Detroit Association of Charities, as well as individual letters that are collected in various places. You can see networks of African Canadians as they move from Ontario to Nebraska, or as they move to Washington, D.C., or New York. So I'm trying to track those things. You see letters of introduction in fraternal organizations. There was a mention of fraternal organizations earlier. Prince Hall Masons are the predominant African-American group, and so when an individual moves, say, from a chapter in Detroit to a chapter in Vancouver, you see letters of introduction saying, oh yes, he's a Mason like you, and you know, please give him the rights as he moves there. Toledo, Ohio, I could be mentioning all kinds of places. There'll be a map in a minute. And you find these little snippets of individuals, right? This is a man who was born in North Carolina. He had gone to British Columbia as a minor. He spends time in Oberlin on and off for the rest of his life in Ohio. And so we have from various parts able to reconstruct his life, but he doesn't really, there's no document where he says, like, I moved from British Columbia to Ohio for this reason, or I moved back to British Columbia for this reason. So I'm trying to find what I can out of these networks in that way. Okay, here's yet another example and yet another example, right? So the goal is to get beyond the ability to say these things in individuals and to talk about the big networks. And so in the time left, I want to talk about the two places I've been trying to do that. One is in the pension files, right? In order to get a pension, you had to prove that you were in this unit with these people and where you had moved since. And so there are sort of informal networks around these agents, as Cameron was talking about, who are sort of commissioned by the federal government. So if you're in Detroit and you know other people from your unit in Detroit, you try to find ways in which their lives have intersected with yours, both before the war, during the war, and since. So you can kind of prove where you've been. And I have at least 100 of these pension files of people who at some point claim to be Canadian. Some of them are not actually Canadian, that's a different story. But in their efforts to make these connections, you see, for example, here, someone who is from St. John, New Brunswick, but he's filing in St. Louis for his citizenship. So there's all kinds of connections here. Windsor, for example, has this unpublished 1864 census where they're trying to track basically how many Americans have come into Windsor during the Civil War. I've been working with some of my students to digitize this and try to make connections of where were people before and where were people after. And that points to the importance of the census as a way to track this. Censuses don't track where you have lived, right? They care about your birthplace and where you live now, but there's no, like, I lived in Canada for 20 years. So I've been trying to track individuals who are children in the census, who were born in Canada and marked as black or mulatto, and then use that to track their entire family, and then to move those families around. In my paper, you see I have what I think of as the undercount and the overcount versions of this. The undercount are places where I can find people in the two censuses, and I can kind of guarantee that the data we're seeing about them is accurate, and I'll just run through an animation not quite as elegant as the one you saw before about that. So here's a sense of 1860 where we see those African Canadians, 1870, 80, 1900, 1910, 1920, and 1930, right, as that generation dies out. But the kind of key moment is something like this, where you see almost all of the movement is actually in the Great Lakes or in the Northeast, not so much to other parts of the country. The other thing I'm trying to balance, though, is what I first found, which was kind of the overcount version of this, right? So here's my initial effort to tabulate this, but I found, looking at some of those dots, that they don't actually represent the reality of the situation. There's that large dot in Pembina, North Dakota. It happens that the census taker there decided to put M for Métis rather than M for mulatto, right? Which was not his instructions. So when the current digitization counts, it counts that even though it's not accurate. Similarly, there are a lot of little pink dots, or I guess they're grayish blue on this particular version, that are mostly in Texas in 1900, and I was like, wow, where did all these African Canadians suddenly go to Texas in 1900? That seemed like a very unusual finding. It turns out they're marked NS, which the system understands to mean Nova Scotia, but in reality meant not stated. There are like tons of people in prisons and mental institutions where they don't have enough information about them. They just have their name, that they're black, and not stated. So that's the kind of data cleaning I've been working on and trying to figure out how to both find these networks and then to really make them meaningful for doing the kind of history I want to do. Thank you.
I'm going to be peak millennial and read my comments from my computer here, so excuse me while I get that pulled up for a second. So I want to first of all say thank you to Cameron, Justin, and Adam for the really interesting papers. I think they all offer really interesting perspectives on the different geographies of power in the 19th century, as well as interesting connections to our previous panel on earlier networks of knowledge. All of our papers had a very wide geographic scope, which I think offers some really productive possibilities for thinking about the geography of archival power, gendered movement, and the geographic stability of state creation in the 19th century. One of the things that I find most striking about all three of these papers is the visibility, or rather the invisibility, of the networks that they examine. For Cameron, the network of state actors is hard to see because of its ephemeral and gossamer nature. For Justin, Indigenous peoples subverted and acted outside of the surveillance of the colonial state, which documented their movements. And for Adam, the social ties which documented the legitimacy of African North Americans' pension claims were themselves often invisible to the surveilling state because their relationships were on the liminal edge of legitimacy. To a certain extent, all of these networks are only semi-visible in the archive because they were so much a part of the fabric of everyday life, that they escaped official documentation in some ways. To that end, I'd be interested to hear you all speak a bit more to what your projects say about what is documentable. Did postmasters consider themselves a part of the state apparatus? Were they conscious of their networks as part of the state apparatus? And did they act on behalf of other territorial or state governments or other quasi-state actors like government-sponsored reservation missionaries? Are there any hints of indigenous modes of documenting connections like winter counts, oral narratives, or naming ceremonies being supplemented by written communication and visiting? Are there suggestions of how knowledge, for example, about the ease of divorce in Canada, circulated through African North American communities? What's the shadow text of your networks, and what can analysis of your networks say about the power relations that created both the networks and the power relations that created their documentation? I'd also like to ask all three of you to consider questions of gender a little further, both broadly and specifically with respect to the invisibility of your networks. Cameron, you suggest that part of the reason for the expansion of the postal network was to enable both economic and domestic connections with family left back east. Could you use the census to track the presence of white women and children in areas near post offices to see if post offices preceded or followed settler colonial families? I'd also be interested to hear if there was a gendered geography in the distribution of your state actors or your state agents. Did women federal workers tend to cluster in coastal and urban areas while men worked in more rural areas, as the examples in your paper suggest? You also suggest that the gossamer ephemerality of the federal networks is due to the political spoils system, but I wonder if it might also have something to do with changing ideas of gendered public and private spheres as the settler state expanded. Justin, I wonder if you could disentangle the gendered makeup of the Native groups who went visiting versus colonial perceptions of them. I can only speak here to my own experience of studying groups in the East, but one of the things that I've seen with groups going visiting is that white Indian agents often, on the one hand, feared groups of Native men who went visiting without women in their party because that meant it might be a war party. But on the other hand, they disliked seeing women travel in those visiting groups because it meant the group wasn't properly civilized into domestic fixity. The circulation of letters through the colonial postal system also seems like it could be an interesting area to explore tensions about perceptions of modernity, authenticity, and fixity. Thinking here about our previous panel, as well as work by Paige Rabeman and Phil Deloria, the indigenous actors in your network seem very conscious of their network building, and I wonder if that's a place to get at what they're thinking about tensions between surveillance, modernity, and fixity. Adam, I also wonder if the geography of the networks you trace might also be gendered in some way. Black and white women necessarily had more limited options for the kinds of jobs your paper suggests that black men were using to travel across these borders. And the examples you suggest, the examples that you give in your paper suggested that men move between households and cities relatively more compared to women. You also give us very brief glimpses of women's networks. For example, how did Emily and Lucretia, Richard Christian's wives, know each other, and how does his sister know them? There seems to be a tension between the officially recognized networks attested to by men and the less visible networks that the women themselves hint at. And I wonder if you could make more of how the state recognized and legitimated gendered networks differently in these pension claims. And finally, and perhaps most obviously, all of the papers on the panel today offer an interesting discussion of the spatial dimension of networks. For all of you, I wonder if you could speak a bit more to how federal policy specifically tried to create a kind of gendered fixity through policy in the West, especially with the 1862 Homestead Act and the 1887 Dawes Allotment Act, which seems to be in the background of all of your papers. Cameron and Justin obviously have some interesting connections between the restriction of Native people's movement and the expansion of the settler colonial state, but I also wonder if Adam, if Black Civil War veterans are part of that story as well. We were talking about this earlier. Did any of them receive land as part of their pension, or did they use their pension to move west into this newly opened Native land? The idea of fixity had very different implications for each of the groups you're looking at. Where Cameron's work unsettles the idea of government stability in the West, the Native people Justin looks at defy attempts to fix them in place, while the African North Americans Adam discusses sought some kinds of fixity for themselves while not fitting into others expected by the American and Canadian state. To circle back to my previous questions about visibility and gender, I think these papers are so exciting because they offer such a broad geography to examine the contours of these networks that are difficult to see precisely because they are so everyday and prosaic. So thank you all.
Does anyone want to respond to Maeve's comments?
We can also keep more time for audience discussion. I have plenty of time.
I'll just briefly, because the paper talks more about the contesting widow cases than I had a chance to talk about here. Because these are records linked to the soldiers, that often they're very male spaces, the pension files. But you do see when it's widows especially in this effort to use women's networks to justify where they've moved, you do see this kind of whole world of working class, often kind of domestic labor in relatively close spaces, like people who knew people in Detroit and Windsor back and forth across the border. That's what you see in those cases that I think, and there's definitely a different network in terms of women's knowledge and women's networking that it's hard to get at because of the nature of these sources.
I can answer your question about women visiting alongside men on these long trips. They absolutely did. There's no indication that there was a fear that the absence of a woman would indicate any sort of negative warlike intentions of the visitor by the 1870s, 1880s. It was assumed that all these visits were friendly. And as far as women as agents hoping women would stay at home and be domestic rather than traveling off, I never really saw that in the complaints of agents. Agents do complain constantly about how visiting interrupts civilizing efforts, the efforts of assimilation, and I suppose the goal here is to get them to farm. If they're out visiting, they're not farming. They're not doing the work. That was the biggest complaint. So to keep them industrious, they should not spend weeks at the reservation in Utah. And so women were certainly part of that effort to keep them at home and become something different. The wandering life was not what American life was. Also, sorry, women were also letter writers as well. As many women, young women were at schools and as men, and they became literate as well, and they used their skills. As far as the Dawes Act, I found a lot of letters written by women to the government complaining or trying to figure out what lands they had, what lands they didn't have, because of the Dawes Act.
I actually have a paper coming out later this year on the role of women in the federal postal system, but I think I'll circle back if we have time, just to make sure that we have enough time for audience questions.
Yeah, I got two questions for Cameron.
Sorry to interrupt, Richard. So people that don't know, Richard John is literally the world's foremost authority of the U.S. postal system, which is like something out of my worst nightmare coming to life right now. So anyway.
So as you know, I'm a great admirer of your work, and I love the map and tweeted it out. But I got two tough questions. First, the actual expansion of the network. As you know, post offices are established under the authority of the Postmaster General. The routes are established by Congress via petition until the 1870s or 80s. So the first question is, what about Congress? I didn't hear you talk about Congress. I didn't see Congress in the paper. The second, tougher question, okay? Gossamer, a fine, filmy substance, cobwebs, ultrafine, diaphanous, gauzy, gauze-like, gossamer thin, delicate, flimsy, floaty. Okay. In your conclusion, could a centralized state or a regulated bureaucracy have worked? That's a good question, and you're reframing this in an interesting way. But the post office that I know from the 1880s is not a gossamer network. It's rule-bound, there are daily postal bulletins, there's a massive paperwork, and it's reliable. Merchants rely on it, ordinary people rely on it, businessmen, mail-order business relies on it. That's not a gossamer network. Andrew Carnegie, in Triumphant Democracy, very admiring. Cyrenaius Osborne Ward, Marxist, ditto. Edward Bellamy, Henry George. None of them would have recognized this as a gossamer network. Like your mentor, Richard White, you tend to saw off the United States at the Mississippi River. And the nationwide institution was not perceived as a gossamer network. And I worry that there is like in Richard White's work, a kind of a neoliberal tinge here that we are eliminating and downplaying, obscuring, and ignoring the creative role of governmental institutions in the late 19th century United States when they had much more legitimacy than corporations, and that in so doing, we're making it very difficult for us to move creatively into the 21st century, where there are all sorts of proposals to look back on American state, New Deal, and further. So that's the tougher challenge. I worry that the gossamer is simply going to be taken up as part of neoliberal markets do it better, small scale, and that would not have been what Cyrenaius Osborne Ward, Andrew Carnegie, Edward Bellamy, or Henry George would have concluded in the 1880s.
Like I said, worst nightmare, right? So to tackle the first question, which is kind of what is the role of Congress, and I actually think this ties to the second question as well. And so I would agree that, and this is why I kind of caveated that by saying, urban postal system, Eastern, especially Northeastern postal system operated very, very differently. The West, I think, is honestly a different animal, but I would say the rural postal network as a whole is actually a different animal, and it's when you actually dive down to the local level and start to look at what these post offices actually were, that you start to see this as a gossamer institution rather than this kind of top-down, centrally planned thing. The reason why this ties into Congress is that when we think of this, right, if we're establishing a new post office, you would think there'd be some kind of centralized authority or control over where it's located, how many people it's serving, is it too close to another one? There is none of that. This was all mediated through settler communities that are petitioning the federal government, oftentimes through their congressperson who has absolutely no incentive for things like efficiency or effectiveness. And so what you get are instances where pretty much any community that wants one can have a post office. And the reason why it's so quickly able to expand is that it's just grafted onto this kind of private system. And so you get instances where I kind of tracked one family and followed them around. One of them becomes a postmaster for 8 months. Never mentions it in his letters. The only reason I know this is because it's in the official documentation, right? This is not really this kind of stable institution. In fact, when he moves to Arizona, it ends up basically writing letters all the time. He's subscribing to half a dozen national newspapers. He has 2 post offices within 2-mile radius of his house, despite the fact that he's literally living in the middle of nowhere on a ranch, right? And to kind of tackle this neoliberal critique, which I fundamentally disagree with, is that I would argue that this model is in fact really detrimental. You see this kind of massive overexpansion in the Western United States into exactly places like Central Arizona, where he basically floods out within 5 years, right? And so this kind of overexpansion, this settler occupation, there is a real dark side to relying on this private system, where if you have postmasters who are also private agents, that means that the success of the system is tied to the success of private companies, private businesses. So when a business owner or a store owner goes bankrupt, the post office disappears, right? And especially in the Western United States, it's not an efficient system. It's requiring huge amounts of money, and it's not recouping that money in terms of effectiveness. So, sorry, I'll stop rambling and let others answer or ask questions.
Hi, I have a question for both Justin and Adam about the Canadian border and sort of how it's permeated and how it's perceived as like a no-go. So I think on Justin's map, there's one case of, I think it was green. It's hard to tell from this far back, but an unallowed visit coming down from Canada to the Flathead Reservation. And certainly, as we know, the U.S.-Canadian border is artificial, certainly, in terms of native territory. So were there requests for visits to cross the international border? Was there concern about native groups crossing the border? And I guess for Adam, this sort of back and forth, how easy was it just to sort of go back and forth across the U.S. border in the late 19th century? Was there much regulation about that? Was there concern about finding or losing people, or what kind of people could emigrate?
So the reservations in what is now North Dakota, also northern Montana, unfortunately the records aren't as complete as some of the more southern reservations, for whatever reason. And so it's harder to gauge how much visitation is going across the border. In visitation requests, folks asking if they could go to Canada, it typically was not met favorably by the agent. There's a whole process, depending on the year, how a visit could be approved or disapproved. Typically, officially you'd have to ask the Commissioner of Indian Affairs if this could happen, which most agents didn't want to do. But in cases, if it was a domestic visit, typically agents would skip the commissioner and just go amongst themselves and set up themselves. But that was not possible was not as allowed with agents in Canada and the United States. So they'd have to go to the commissioner, and it was not typically something that the commissioner would allow. And so that artificial line, in the 1870s, 1880s, there's still plenty of natives going back and forth, not caring that this is a national border. As we get later on, there's more, at least by appearance, there's more control. That one visit on the map, I can't remember the details of it. It was done without permission. Also, the further west we go into northern Montana, the less I know about it. But I do know that in 1890, 1891, word of the ghost dance spreads into Canada. And so in my book, I use the ghost dance as sort of like this tracing agent, how the ghost dance spread along these networks that already existed. And I can see where these ideas are flowing in the network that existed. And those networks were there, and they do go into Canada. So I do know that there's interaction. There's a lot of relatives too. I mean, you have Sioux both sides of the border. Ken.
Yeah, in this period, there's not a lot of concern about people crossing the border unless they are of Asian descent, right? So, the Chinese exclusion in 1882 becomes as we have lots of scholarship now, talks about, especially on the Mexican border, but also the border with British Columbia. There's an effort to keep people of Asian descent from crossing the border. Everybody else, they're interested in questions around if you want to claim citizenship or if you want to be naturalized, but if you want to just go there, they're not particularly worried about it. And there's sort of ongoing moments where, like in 1870, there's a Congress actually passes a naturalization bill that says people of African descent are allowed to naturalize, which is a change from 1790. And I'm arguing that that has to do with these returning children of the Underground Railroad, right? As we know in all those later citizenship cases, people are kind of aware that they could come into the United States and be identified as black, but when Jim Crow gets really tight, they have no interest in doing so, right? So hence you have Syrians and Indians and various other East Asians and others go before the Supreme Court in cases arguing that they are white, right? So the fact that there actually is a way in. The other thing is that even before the Civil War, a lot of these African North Americans have jobs that take them back and forth across the Great Lakes or across the river, right? They work on steamships. So it allows them to move people that way, but also it allows them to kind of be in the right country on the right day, depending on how the politics are shaping up that day in Toledo versus in Toronto.
Hi, thank you all for your papers. I'm Catherine Treesh. I'm a PhD student at Yale and an APS fellow this summer. I have a question mainly for Adam, and it's about kind of the spatial awareness that Cameron in particular brought to his project. I'm wondering, you have that great spatial awareness in America, but I didn't see so much of it in Canada. And so to put it briefly, where can you tell from the data where in Canada most likely people are to be returning to the US? And I think this is important, this type of spatial awareness is important because it makes us consider, people could be returning to the US not only to return to the US, but to flee from Canada. And so, the political situation, any particular point or part of Canada at any one point might, really key into why people are returning. And I didn't see so much of that in what you presented here. So I'm wondering if you're thinking about that at all as your project goes forward.
Yeah, so that gets to the can of worms element. Because there's a community in the Maritimes that are linked to Black loyalist communities, right? That are in Canada significantly earlier, and their relationship with Boston and New England is very different, and it isn't based around the Fugitive Slave Act. Similarly, the population in British Columbia is almost all people who had been free in the United States, had been in California for the gold rush, and then after Dred Scott go to either Australia or British Columbia to follow mining rushes, and sometimes think of that as in relation to Dred Scott, but sometimes they're just following the other miners. And yet another example is there's a community that in the Bonanza homesteading period in Alberta that go to Amber Valley. That's in the 19-teens and 20s. And they're basically coming out of the all-black communities in Oklahoma and Kansas, and they're followed there by the KKK. So, they're suddenly a Canadian KKK because white Americans have followed black Americans into Alberta and Manitoba. So I talk about US-Canadian borders, and they're all very different, and the populations are very different. There's a population in Toronto that, for example, that seems very much linked to an urban population of people who had been free African Americans before the end of slavery in Fredericksburg, Virginia, versus the groups that are in southwestern Ontario, who are almost all from rural spaces and almost all fugitives. So it's very complicated, and I'm trying to figure out what fits in the final project and what will end up somewhere else. But yes, that's an excellent question. That there's not one Canada and there's not one border.
Pete Messer again. I got a question for Cameron, reflecting on both the kind of gossamer network, the role of coercion, and perhaps the shadow text. I'm thinking as I look at your map also not of simply the dots, but the territory between the dots. It seems to me before you have an effective post service, you have to have control of that, at least enough of that territory so that people and letters can move back and forth. And as one of your early maps suggest, a lot of that territory starts as native territory. So the the emergence of the Gossamer Post network, it seems to me, is built on a much less Gossamer, or maybe, please reflect on this, I shouldn't tell you, is the Gossamer network built on a much less Gossamer network of forcible removal, military control, and ultimately state action?
Yes. No, but it's absolutely right. I think the central story of state power in the West is one of coercive power and violence against indigenous peoples. That is fundamental. What I see this as coercive state power is what enables kind of the seizure of territory, but it doesn't guarantee the occupation of territory by a settler colonial population, and that is where the Gossamer network comes into play. The U.S. Post and this kind of rural network, its ability to immediately and rapidly expand into really distant, otherwise remote places, provide this service to a colonizing population, doesn't cause them to move there, but I think it does facilitate and even in some cases accelerate it in really fundamental ways. So that would be my answer to that.
Okay, we have one last question.
I think you may have answered that already, but I was wondering if you had data to see. It seems like, the main trend is to see Indian territory shrinking, and I noticed that some post offices were inside the Indian territory. Is there a sort of correlation between if you resist to having post office, if you're a sort of place where nobody wants to do it, you resist better, or is it the other way around, where if you are actually opening post office in your reservation, you resist better to this trend? I was wondering if you had any data on that.
So I think it's a compelling spatial pattern, right? In that areas where there are reservations, there's usually only a handful of post offices operating, and usually those post offices are not meant to serve the needs of Native people, but to serve the needs of government officials there. So they're usually located at the agency office that Justin noted, or army forts that are within the borders of Indian reservations. And why I think it's even more kind of impressive and even important that Native people during the 1880s are managing to kind of co-opt this system to suit their own needs, right? When it's designed from a very structural standpoint and even a spatial standpoint to serve the needs of government officials who are in charge of kind of subjugating them, so.
I found descriptions of agents complaining how many Indians are using the post at their offices, how they're cramming in. When the mail comes in, you have dozens of folks coming in to get their mail or send out letters or ask literate folks to write and mail things for them. Eventually, I think most of the letters coming out of many reservations by 1890 or so are sent by natives, and the Native populations on those reservations much lower population density, so you don't need as many post offices to serve those populations. Although there are complaints from Indians writing to the government asking for more post offices, saying they're traveling a day, to get down to the agency office to send a letter. So
we're going to take a break now.